Have you ever stopped to wonder how giants like Apple, Nike, and Tesla don't just get media coverage, but they literally own the entire story? While most companies out there are scrambling to push out their next press release, just crossing their fingers for a tiny little blip of attention, these elite brands are operating on a completely different level. Well, today on The Explainer, we're going to unpack the exact secret behind how they pull it off. We're looking at something most PR professionals honestly never formally learn, a concept called the narrative stack. So if you want to understand how the world's absolute biggest brands engineer perception, you are definitely in the right place.
Look, the vast majority of PR teams, they're basically playing checkers. They're highly reactive. A trend pops up on social media, they react. A competitor launches a new product, they react. They're just constantly trying to force themselves into conversations that are already happening. But the elite brands, they're playing chess, and they're usually about 5 moves ahead. And honestly, the craziest part is that they aren't waiting around for conversations to happen so they can jump in. No way. They are deliberately engineering those conversations years in advance. They don't just play on the board, they dictate the board.
So here's our game plan for today's Explainer. First, we'll decode the narrative stack, then unpack the 4 narrative layers. After that, we'll look at why traditional PR usually fails, how you can build your own stack, and finally, how to truly master perception control. All right, let's jump right into part 1, decoding the narrative stack, and moving from single campaigns to a compounding architecture.
Okay, so we really need to shift our mindset away from single, isolated campaigns. The narrative stack is a layered system of stories that shape how people perceive your brand over time. And I want to really emphasize that word layered and the phrase over time, because this isn't about pulling off a single viral stunt. It's not a cleverly written press release. It is a compounding narrative architecture. Think of it kind of like building a giant skyscraper. You don't just throw up some glass panes and hope the thing stays standing, right? You have to build a solid foundation, a framework, and specific layers that structurally shape that perception from the ground up.
So how does this actually play out in people's heads? Well, think of it as a path to truth. Down at the bottom, one isolated story might get you some attention, a quick blip on the radar. But if you have multiple, aligned stories all pointing in the same direction, now you're starting to build real belief. And when you maintain those consistent narratives across the board over a long period, you actually build truth in the audience's mind. And once something becomes an undeniable truth for your audience, PR gets incredibly easy. Your audience just accepts your positioning as a basic fact of life.
Moving on to section 2, the 4 narrative layers. Let's unpack this architecture right from the ground up.
Let's walk through this blueprint layer by layer. The very bottom layer is the foundational narrative. This is your big why. It's the core belief your brand absolutely wants to own. It's not a product claim, it is an identity statement. Actually, fun fact, Apple's famous Think Different campaign didn't even show a computer. It was just pure foundational belief. Right above that is the category narrative. This is where you define your operating space. Think about it. Tesla didn't just sell cars, they pushed this massive narrative that electric vehicles are the absolute future of all transportation. And because of that category control, literally every single EV conversation implicitly includes Tesla. Moving up, we hit the campaign narrative. These are your short-term spikes. And honestly, this is what most PR teams mistakenly focus all their energy on. But campaigns should only exist to reinforce those bottom 2 layers. When Nike runs a new campaign, they aren't just selling you shoes, they're constantly reinforcing empowerment and discipline. And finally, at the very top, we have the cultural narrative. This is the holy grail, folks. This is when the media repeats your story, influencers echo it, and most importantly, your own customers defend it for you. The narrative doesn't even belong to you anymore, it belongs to the culture. It's completely self-sustaining PR.
If you take just one thing away today, make it this. Good PR doesn't just promote products, it installs beliefs. Let that sink in for a second. Selling a product, that's just marketing. But installing a core belief deep in the minds of your audience, that is true perception engineering. That's the sheer power of the foundational layer of the stack.
Which brings us to section 3, why traditional PR fails, or as I like to call it, the danger of the hamster wheel. Man, does this hamster wheel feel familiar to anyone else? Teams get hopelessly stuck in endless press release cycles. They rely on completely reactive storytelling, just desperately jumping on whatever happens to be trending today. They're constantly chasing these fleeting, short-term wins. Honestly, the defining symptom of a broken PR team is the question they ask. Hey, how do we get coverage this month? When you operate like this, without a narrative stack, you just end up with highly inconsistent messaging, super weak positioning, and ultimately, a forgettable brand. And worst of all, you are entirely dependent on the media to validate you,
instead of actively influencing the media landscape yourself.
If you want to break out of that exhausting tactical mindset, you have to force yourself into a long-term strategic view. You've got to ask yourself one brutal question. What should people believe about us 3 years from now? Snap out of asking what's going to get you covered next Tuesday. If you can clearly answer what they should believe in 3 years, congratulations, you have the seed of your narrative stack.
All right, Section 4, building your narrative stack. Let's get into a really practical framework for this.
Here are the 4 steps to actually build your architecture.
Step 1, define your foundational narrative. What belief do you want to own? And listen, if your answer sounds like a catchy marketing tagline, you aren't going deep enough. Step 2, map your category narrative. How do you frame the problem differently so you become the leader of a movement and not just another player in a crowded market? Step 3 is absolutely critical. Audit your campaigns. Look back at your last 5 PR campaigns. Did they genuinely reinforce your core narrative, or did they just promote features? Because I have to warn you, if they just promoted features, this is exactly where your narrative power is actively leaking out. And finally, step 4, design narrative consistency. Actually, this is where most teams completely fall apart. You have to ensure that your narrative shows up everywhere. And that brings us to the secret glue of this whole shebang. Repetition is not boring. Repetition is how narratives stick. You just have to show up consistently. Your foundational and category narratives need to be seamlessly woven into media interviews, founder posts on social media, everyday content, and yes, even your basic product messaging. Consistency is literally the only way to build that undeniable truth we talked about earlier.
Finally, Section 5, mastering perception control and making that elite mindset shift.
We are completely shifting away from this outdated goal of mere visibility. Visibility is just about being louder, which makes you inherently dependent on desperately grabbing media attention. The new goal is perception control. This isn't about shouting at people, it's about being clearer, more consistent, and highly intentional at scale. Brands like Apple, Nike, and Tesla, they don't win because they shout the loudest. They win because their narrative stack is perfectly engineered and flawlessly consistent. As we wrap up today's explainer, I really want to cement this idea in your head. Attention fades, but narratives, they compound. A wild, viral stunt might buy you 15 minutes of fame, sure, but a well-engineered narrative stack acts as a massive compounding asset over the years, doing all the heavy lifting for you as it ascends straight into the culture.
So I want to leave you with a really memorable litmus test for all your future planning. The next time you sit down to brainstorm a campaign, do not ask, will this get attention? Instead, I want you to think like a chess master and ask yourself, does this strengthen our narrative stack? If the answer is no, scrap it. Go back to the drawing board. Start engineering your perception layer by layer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I seriously challenge you to start building your stack today.